Since the 97 financial crisis, the Asian Bond Market Initiative, the credit guarantee facilities, but still Asian financial sector, remains very much a bank-dominated financial sector. And unless and until the capital markets are developed, and the capital markets are developed in a regional sense, you really would not be seeing adequate progress on integration. A case in point, and I never tire of this example, a Thai investor wanting to invest in bahts in Laos finds it easier to go to London and through London invest in Laos rather than just across the border. That's because of the very thick borders we have in the financial markets. And the same applies to South Asia and other parts of the region. So that's the third area that I see of great cooperation potential in Asia. A fourth, I would say, is access to natural resources. When we talk about India, ASEAN, and China, Japan, there is an intrinsic assumption here that we are looking east, and that's important. But there's a huge area on the west, which is also part of Asia. How about the energy sources in Central Asia? How do we tap them to serve the markets in China, serve the markets in South Asia? The TAPI, the Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India pipeline, for example. But there are challenges to those. How do we develop river basins, Mekong, Ganga? That's something that we've talked about a lot. And other than some slight progress on the navigation side, water navigation side, we really haven't tapped the exploitation of the river potential of this region. The huge hydropower potentials in Nepal and Laos, for example, and Bhutan, still go untapped because we have not been able to get a regional perspective of energy sharing. So if Nepal and India were to develop, one being a hydropower potential rich, the other being starved of electricity, huge demand, similarly Laos and Thailand, the sharing and access of natural resources obviously is one area of great potential for cooperation. And again, I don't want to sound parochial. I'm not talking about Asia as Fortress Asia. I am talking about Asia integrated with the world, but obviously it makes much more sense economically, politically, and otherwise to look closer to home. And therefore, the huge markets of China and India, these two countries alone can drive the demand for natural resources, for any other products that one can think of, if only we could think beyond immediate national borders. Fifth would be climate change. This is one area where I think, though both India and China have, I think in the recent years, particularly after Mr. Trump's withdrawal from the Paris Climate Accord, I think both India and China have shown leadership, but it's not enough. And I'll just give you a very simple example, and it's very telling. A few years back at the Asian Development Bank, a study was done together with Cambridge University, which looked at some consequences of global warming, and it showed that if just things continue as they are, by 2100, sea levels globally would rise slightly over 50 centimeters, over 1990 levels. If that were to be so, and it's quite possible that it could be so, interestingly, 15 out of the 20 top cities affected, and many of them inundated, and 9 of the top 10 would be in Asia. And it's not just we're talking about Maldives and some coastal cities in India or China. We're talking about Calcutta, we're talking about Dhaka, we're talking about Bangkok. And this is not a out-of-the-line projection. This was essentially a very realistic scenario that this modeling projected. Of course, like all models, subject to assumptions. But the basic point is that Asia needs to think of climate change for its very survival, not just economic survival, but just survival. And the sixth would follow in terms of responding to common regional threats, be it natural disasters, epidemics, drugs, or whatever. Every year, Singapore and Malaysia suffer the consequences of forest fires in Indonesia. Within the subcontinent, the stubble burning in Punjab affects the rest of India. So it's not a regional issue, but the same sort of considerations apply. So the environmental issues, the deforestation issues, the trade issues, the trafficking issues are all regional in character. So talking about human trafficking, talking about illegal trade or drugs, all have to be considered within that context. And the seventh and the last, and I'm certainly no expert in that area, and other people would be much more capable of commenting on it, but I think there are huge security implications for greater regional cooperation or the lack of it. And I know that a point is made, and I can empathize with that greater connectivity somehow endangers security because you make it possible for people to move, and with people, other things move, including terrorism, including insurgents, etc. I would submit that the position, at least I take, is just the opposite. I think enhanced connectivity actually enhances security. Once you're invested in another country, once you're invested in your neighbor, you have greater incentives to not go to war or not go to do things which are detrimental because what goes around comes around. So security, in a broader sense, I think is served better by greater regional cooperation. Now, those are the broad 7 points, Mr. Chairman, I thought I'll put on the table. The way I see it, as Ambassador Kumar had said in the previous session, that I don't think we have a choice. It's a question of how well we'll do it, and the consequences of not doing well will not be just a zero-sum game that somebody will be better off and somebody will be worse off. I think we'll all be worse off, and that's not an outcome anybody desires. Mr. Chairman, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rajat, for an excellent presentation. This comes to you naturally from all the years that you have put in running the Asian Development Bank. You are able to take the broad view of what is happening in sub-regions and regions and in Asia as a whole, whereas many of us here are stuck in terms of reflecting on managing relationships between two regions or sub-regions or even nations. I think the 7-point agenda makes a great deal of sense, especially when you talk about the economic aspects of Asia's integration, and you make it clear that you're not talking of a fortress Asia, but perhaps an Asia which is very well integrated with the rest of the world. The only point on which perhaps there could be debate, and naturally that would take place later, is the impact of geopolitics on these economic considerations and economic rationale. Is it not possible to conceive that geopolitics ends up trumping geoeconomics, pure economic considerations? But that is something that probably we might take it up later depending on the interest of the panelists and the audience. Thank you, Rajat, once again. May I now invite Dr. Phillips Vermonte to address you.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman, Ambassador Bhatia. And then I'd like to start with thanking RIS for inviting me, especially Dr. Prabir Dey. This is my first time to India, but I'm not going to put any maps. So if I miss some points on India, please forgive me. But we just had our first security dialogue with Indian counterpart in December about 3 weeks ago with the DPG, Delhi Policy Group, and of which Ambassador Birananda was a member. So to me, it's incredible that within that short time span, I engaged twice with Indian colleagues in the discussion of our strategic partnership between India and Indonesia and India and ASEAN. Much has been said since the morning, so it seems to me that I would speak at the risk of repeating some of the themes that have been discussed. So I'd like to divide my presentation into two parts. Number one, I'd like to repeat and bring us back to the reality where we are today in terms of world politics. And that, I think, will affect the way we see ourselves, the way we see our relationship between our two entities. And then in the second part, after laying out what I think about what has been happening globally, then how we can put ourselves, how India and Indonesia fit in that kind of a scenario. Now, it goes without saying that we are now living in uncertainty as we know it. President Trump is pressing the reset buttons on so many things. I agree with Ambassador Rajat earlier that probably climate change is one of the areas that we need to work more, but with the US is withdrawing from the Paris Agreement, that would allay the pressure of which country will take the lead, has the resources, and so on and so forth. And that might give China some role of leadership in that, ironically, in that particular issue. Now, secondly, at the global level, I think we have all heard about the disappointment of the nature of the international order. The US complaining, especially President Trump. The Chinese are complaining as well on the nature of the international order. If you ask the Russians as well, they are complaining. At the regional level, people in Europe complaining about European Union, at least the British, and they have said, and they have decided. So now it seems that we are questioning all the international order. And that might be a sign of the withdrawal of a superpower, and of course the rise of a new, potentially superpower. And the rise of China is now probably turning into, or already the eruption of China. China's investment is everywhere, in Africa, in Southeast Asia. About a few months ago, they released the target of sending tourists in the next 5 years in the range of 300 million Chinese tourists across the globe. So you can imagine Indonesia has only 250 people. But China targets that it will send 300 million tourists across the globe. That will affect the economy of the country that become the target of these tourists. We are not talking about hard security issues, but we are talking about something that China is able to be doing. Number 4, we have global hotspots that until today we don't know how to solve. The Korean Peninsula, the Middle East, and in our part of the world is the South China Sea, which all points to the weakness of the international community or the international law, at least in terms of enforcement. Who will be able to enforce international law? Right now, we don't have any country. The US has no interest, it seems to me. China has yet to reach that level of being a superpower that can provide international public goods, which are security, peace, and stability. So maybe we are also estimating China here. So we are in doubt whether the US under President Trump, maybe in the next 4 years, or if he got re-elected, then we have to live with President Trump for 8 years, whether the US can continue its play to provide this international public goods. If the US cannot, will China step in? But if China step in, will China act as a belligerent power or benign power? We have yet to see. But so far the evidence points that China is potentially not so benign power. But the US also is not a benign power right now in the eyes of many Southeast Asian countries. So we are ending up having potentially two belligerent superpowers. And that affects the way countries, at least in Southeast Asia, sees how we engage with the US and how we engage with China. Number 4, because of this uncertainty, I think we have to look at the emergence of the new geopolitical map. And it's been discussed in our discussion with the Indian counterparts last month, that we have now two blocks, so to speak. Number 1 is the Eurasian versus the Atlantic. It's the traditional geopolitical competition that we have seen for decades. But secondly, we have, I think, the competition between the continental and the maritime, which, of course, Indonesia is part of this maritime. And as far as I understand, India sees itself as a maritime country as well. But I'd like to deepen on that particular aspect, that we are, both Indonesia and India, are not only a maritime country, but maritime democracies.